I'm Errol Barnett at the CBS Broadcast Center here in New York. Israel's highly anticipated ground offensive against Hamas in Gaza could be launched at any moment. Both sides traded rocket fire for a 10th straight day. Buildings were destroyed in Gaza as sirens are heard in cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, it's getting worse. Officials say hospitals in the territory are almost completely out of basic necessities like clean water, food and fuel. They also say many patients cannot be moved elsewhere. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are fleeing south from Gaza City. Israel warned over the weekend it would advance into Gaza by land, air and sea. The U.S. and several other countries are attempting to negotiate with Egypt to let aid in and Palestinian Americans out through the Rafah crossing in the south. More than 4,200 people at this point have died on both sides of this conflict. At least 30 Americans are included in that number. Additionally, Israeli officials say roughly 200 people are being held hostage right now by Hamas, which was more than was initially reported. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel meeting with officials in an effort to prevent this conflict from spilling into other parts of the region.
You know our deep commitment to Israel's right, indeed its obligation, to defend itself and to defend its people. And in that, you have and will always have the support of the United States.
CBS News foreign correspondent Imitaz Tyab joins us now from Jerusalem. And Imitaz, that's just one of the locations in the country hearing air raid sirens, throughout the day and over the last week. Just tell us what your experience has been and what you've seen.
Yeah, hey, Errol, good to be with you. It's not often you hear air raid sirens here in Jerusalem, but we heard just that. In fact, we could see just above our heads the Iron Dome technology intercepting those rockets, which we understand were fired from one of the Palestinian factions inside Gaza known as Islamic Jihad. The Iron Dome, of course, which is largely funded by the U.S., is a sophisticated and very powerful tool in the Israeli arsenal to really defend itself from the rocket fire that's coming in from Gaza. But that rocket fire really just underscores the fact, Errol, that Hamas and indeed those other armed factions inside Gaza are, despite the devastation that we've seen across the Gaza Strip, still have the capacity to fire at Israel, sometimes with very devastating effect. Errol.
And Imitaz, we know that according to Israel's defense forces, the ground operation, it's been imminent for days now. The warning, the 24-hour warning came late last week for people to flee northern Gaza. But we know there's an international effort to protect civilians, and civilians constantly are caught in the middle of this conflict. Do we know any more about why there has been a delay about this ground invasion?
Yeah, it's interesting. You're absolutely right. I mean, our own understanding is that the Israeli military has given the green light to the government to say we're ready to go in. But a couple of things are going on. Honestly, it's the weather. The weather has turned. It's been a bit rainy. And I think the Israeli military is taking no chances and wants to ensure that they have the perfect conditions before they launch that air, land, and sea invasion of the Gaza Strip. But as you also rightly point out, there's a lot of diplomacy going on behind the scenes. You have the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who's back here in Israel, even though he was just here a few days ago. And he's really just been crisscrossing around the region, going to Arab capitals to try to figure out some sort of way forward that will prevent, as you rightly pointed out, the kind of civilian casualties that we've been seeing, and will likely see spike even further if that ground invasion happens, or when that ground invasion happens. And so there's a few things going on at the moment, but the reality is that Israel has the upper hand here. It is a huge military. It is one of the most powerful militaries in the world, but that's not to say that this is going to be easy for them. There's a reason Israel has only gone into Gaza twice, despite having fought 5 wars with Hamas now, and that's because the terrain there is very risky, very dangerous. If you go into areas like Gaza City, I've been to Gaza City multiple times, it is very heavily built up. You add on to the fact that so much of it is destroyed, and Hamas has very likely booby-trapped it, laid a lot of landmines, has snipers throughout it. It is going to be a very, very dangerous fight. And Israel, of course, wants to limit its own casualties before it goes inside Gaza. Errol.
And you know what's interesting, Imitaz, is the humanitarian situation in Gaza was bad on a good day, to really use simple words for something so horrific, and it's worsening. And now you have thousands of Palestinians moving south, fleeing this impending ground invasion. But to go where exactly? We know Palestinian Americans are trying to get into Egypt through the Rafah crossing. How challenging is that for them and for Palestinians who are trying to get out?
Yeah, it's really hard to wrap one's mind around just the scale of the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Gaza. You know, again, I was in Gaza in 2014 during that 6-week war with Israel. And when you consider the fact that that was a 6-week war, and here we are 10 days into this one, and there's now more people dead in this war inside of Gaza than that previous 6-week conflict, it really just underscores just how dire the situation is. And on top of it, the fact that we've seen now 1 million Palestinians, 1 million, this is a place which has a population of 2 million, so half the population of Gaza has moved from the north of the Strip, the most heavily populated area, including Gaza City, to the south, which is less populated, but also has, frankly, less development. There's nowhere really to go for people there. They're essentially just out in the open. And if you consider the fact that Israel has essentially stopped water, fuel, food, anything from coming in, people are basically there with nothing. And the world is deeply concerned, and rightly so. This, despite the fact that there's so much violence going on, if you have 2 million people crammed into this tiny little corner of what is already a tiny place, it's only going to lead to even more misery. And that is why Secretary Blinken has been on this tour around the region, trying to work with the Israelis, but also get support from countries around the Middle East to prevent the kind of catastrophe that we would be seeing, and that's the UN's word, catastrophe, the humanitarian proportions without the kind of help that they need. So there is a lot going on, but really, Errol, as we've seen over the last 10 days inside Gaza, it is the people, it is the civilians who are suffering the most.
A sobering assessment there. Imitaz Tyab, thank you very much.